The storm arrived on Kepler 283d with the subtlety of a sledgehammer through a violin, which is to say, it arrived exactly as storms tend to arrive on planets whose magnetic fields treat meteorological prediction software the way a cat treats a carefully organized desk. One moment the research outpost sat beneath a sky the color of tarnished copper, and the next moment that sky was trying very hard to murder everything beneath it. Iris Tamblyn had been underground when it started, precisely 300 meters down in the geological survey bunker, examining core samples that suggested the planet's mantle was doing something interesting with rare Earth elements. The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong topside was when the lights flickered, died, and then were replaced by the anemic glow of emergency phosphorescence that made everything look like it was drowning in old dishwater. The second indication was the sound, a bass rumble that traveled through solid rock and announced that the universe was displeased. She made her way to the surface access tunnel and found the pressure door jammed half open, which was concerning because pressure doors were generally quite committed to being either fully open or fully closed. Through the gap, she could see what used to be the research outpost and what was now an abstract sculpture titled "Technology Meets Nature, Nature Wins." The prefabricated shelters, designed by people who understood materials science but had apparently never met weather, were scattered across the valley like a child's toys after a tantrum. The central power generator, which had been humming along with the smug confidence of advanced engineering, was now a twisted wreck still smoking from the lightning strike that had introduced several million volts directly into its delicate circuitry. The violet color of the residual burns suggested the local atmosphere did interesting things to electrical discharge, which would have been fascinating if it weren't so immediately problematic. Three figures huddled near the one structure still partially intact, the equipment storage shed, which had survived primarily because it was built into the hillside, and the hillside was substantially less interested in moving than the equipment it contained. Iris picked her way across the debris field, noting with the detached part of her mind that catalogued everything that the emergency beacon was buried under approximately 2 tons of collapsed housing module, which meant nobody was calling for help anytime soon. Kurik spotted her first. The Zentari engineer was soaked, his protective membrane glistening in the dim light, and he radiated the kind of focused distress that came from being a species that evolved in climate-controlled underground warrens and was now experiencing weather as a direct personal attack. Communications are non-functional, he said, which in Zentari thinking was probably the most important fact available. All primary systems are offline. The beacon is inaccessible. Dr. Phelan, the Lyrasian medical officer, looked pale, which was notable because Lyrasians were already quite pale under normal circumstances. Her species came from a world where weather meant the temperature might vary by 2 degrees if you traveled to the poles, and this experience was clearly rewriting her understanding of environmental stability. She was clutching a medical scanner that was trying very hard to function and failing in a way that suggested its internal components were now arranged more artistically than functionally. Mikkel, the young Dren anthropologist, was simply sitting on a piece of debris with the expression of someone whose theoretical understanding of hardship had just met hardship's significantly less theoretical cousin. The Dren had a lovely civilization built on technological cushioning from environmental challenges, and Mikkel's field experience had previously consisted of studying other people's survival techniques from the safety of climate-controlled observation stations. "Is anyone injured?" Iris asked, because this seemed like the place to start. They all confirmed they were physically intact, which was fortunate, because the medical equipment was as dead as everything else. Iris surveyed the wreckage more systematically. The food synthesizers were crushed. The emergency rations had been stored in the main facility, which was now distributed across 50 square meters in pieces, none larger than a briefcase. The environmental suits were shredded. The solar collectors were gone, not broken, literally gone, presumably traveling at speed toward some other part of the planet. The backup batteries were drained from the storm's electromagnetic pulse, and the charging equipment was crushed. The other three began trying to salvage what they could, which mostly meant pulling pieces of sophisticated technology from the wreckage and running diagnostics that confirmed what was visually obvious. Nothing was working, nothing would work, and the tools needed to fix anything were themselves broken. It was the kind of circular problem that technology-dependent species found particularly distressing. Iris watched them for approximately 10 minutes, then walked away from the debris field toward the tree line. "Where are you going?" Corix called after her. "To get rocks," Iris said, which was clearly not the answer he'd expected. The forest began about 40 meters from what used to be the outpost's perimeter. The local flora was doing well, having successfully ignored the storm with the indifference of organisms that had been dealing with this planet's violent weather for millions of years. Iris walked the perimeter, examining the ground. She needed stones of a particular type, dense, non-porous, roughly the size of her fist. Sedimentary rock would shatter when heated. Porous volcanic rock might explode. She needed something solid, something that would hold heat without destroying itself in the process. She found what she needed near an outcropping, where erosion had exposed older geological layers. The stones were smooth from water wear, dark gray, heavy. She carried them back to the outpost 6 at a time, arranging them in a circle about a meter across, in a cleared area upwind of the bunker entrance. The ground was still damp from the storm, which was good. Fire and dry grass were a combination best avoided unless you enjoyed uncontrolled combustion. The others had stopped their salvage efforts and were watching her with visible confusion. Iris ignored them and returned to the forest. This time she was looking for wood, but not just any wood. Green branches were useless, full of moisture. They'd smoke and smolder without burning properly. She needed dead wood, dry wood, wood that had been seasoned by time and weather. She examined trees, looking for dead falls, standing dead timber, branches that had dried while still attached to the tree. She collected an armload of thin branches first, then progressively thicker pieces, sorting them by size. She built a structure within the stone circle, a base of the finest material, then a teepee arrangement of progressively larger sticks, leaving space for air to flow. Fire, despite what people thought, was quite particular about its requirements. It needed fuel, heat, and oxygen in the right proportions, and building a fire was less about raw materials and more about understanding the geometry of combustion. "What are you doing?" Corix asked, standing at a careful distance. "Building a fire," Iris said, adjusting a stick that wasn't quite right. "Why?" It was a reasonable question from a species whose interaction with combustion was entirely industrial. For heat, light, cooking. The usual reasons. "We need to focus on repairing the communication equipment, Doctor," Phelan said, not unkindly. "We need to contact the orbital station." Iris looked at the wreckage, then at the medical officer. "With what?" "The communications equipment is buried under the housing module. The backup systems are fried. The handheld units are dead, and we have no way to charge them. The orbital station doesn't expect contact for 8 more days. We can spend those 8 days trying to rebuild technology from broken pieces, or we can spend them staying warm, fed, and alive." The logic was difficult to argue with, but the aliens still looked uncertain. Building a fire seemed like going backward, like admitting defeat. Iris understood the feeling. Her own species had spent millennia trying to move beyond exactly these techniques. But humans had also retained the knowledge, passed down through generations, maintained in cultural pockets even when it seemed unnecessary. Her grandmother had taught her these skills on family camping trips, had insisted that knowing how to survive without technology was part of being human, part of remembering where you came from. She gathered a handful of dry grass and fibrous fungal growth that grew on dead trees, shredding it into a nest. From her field kit, one of the few things that had survived in the bunker, she retrieved a piece of metal and found a fragment of quartz among the debris. She knelt beside her prepared structure and struck the metal against the quartz, angling the sparks toward the tinder bundle. The first sparks died. The second batch caught briefly, smoking, then faded. The third attempt produced a tiny coal that Iris gently blew on, feeding it oxygen, encouraging it. A thin thread of smoke appeared, then a small flame. She transferred the burning tinder to the base of her structure and watched as the fire found the smallest branches, climbed them, grew. The aliens drew closer, their academic understanding of combustion meeting its practical application. The fire grew steadily, consuming the carefully arranged fuel, producing heat and light that didn't depend on batteries or solar cells or functional civilization. The temperature was dropping as Kepler 283D's sun approached the horizon, and without environmental systems, the cold became noticeable. The fire pushed back against it, creating a sphere of warmth that felt almost alive. Mikel extended his hands toward the flames, then pulled them back quickly. "It's quite hot." "That's generally the idea," Iris said, feeding larger branches into the fire now that it was established. Fire is particular about its relationships. Feed it too much too fast, and you smother it, starve it, and it dies. Pay attention, and it'll work for you. They sat around the fire as darkness fell completely. The flames provided light that danced and shifted, so different from the steady glow of artificial illumination. Something about it was soothing, perhaps because fire had been the first technology, the first time some ancestor had looked at something dangerous and thought about making it useful. Every species that reached the stars had gone through this stage, but most had forgotten it so completely that sitting around a campfire felt alien. The next morning arrived with the particular crispness that suggested the planet's weather was feeling satisfied with its recent work. Iris woke before the others, fed the fire back to life from the coals she'd banked the night before, and considered the food situation. The destroyed synthesizers weren't coming back. The emergency rations were gone. Each team member had nutrition packs in their personal kits, compressed bars that tasted like optimism and chemicals, enough for perhaps 2 days at rationing levels. After that, they'd need real food, and the orbital station wouldn't miss their scheduled check-in for 8 days. Phelan emerged from the bunker and approached the fire, drawn by its warmth. "We should ration the nutrition packs carefully." "We should," Iris agreed. "We should also figure out what else we can eat." The research outpost had been collecting samples of local flora for weeks, cataloging them, running them through analysis that confirmed which ones were chemically toxic and which ones were merely unpalatable. The samples were still in the bunker, stored in stasis containers that ran on redundant power cells. Iris retrieved them and spread them out near the fire. Mikel joined them, looking at the collection with academic interest. "We confirmed the tubers from the streamside plants are non-toxic. The leafy greens from the forest edge vegetation are digestible. The fungal bodies from the dead wood are safe. But non-toxic doesn't mean appetizing. We tried the raw tubers. They're bitter and fibrous." "Raw," Iris said. "Everything tastes better cooked." Corix, who had been examining the fire with engineering interest, looked skeptical. Cooking is a preservation technique. It denatures proteins and breaks down cellular walls, but it doesn't fundamentally change nutritional content. It changes everything else, Iris said. She selected several of the tubers, purple, dense, roughly the size of her fist, and used a flat stone to scrape them clean. She buried them in the coals at the edge of the fire, covering them with ash. Then she took the leafy greens and arranged them on a frame of green branches suspended over the flames. She filled a salvaged container with water from the nearby stream. The analysis had confirmed it was safe after boiling, and set it at the fire's edge. The others watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to doubt. The smells began after about 10 minutes. The tubers released a starchy sweetness as their starches broke down. The greens gave off an herbaceous aroma as volatile compounds were released or neutralized. The boiling water began to steam, purifying itself through simple physics. After 30 minutes, Iris retrieved one of the tubers using a pair of sticks as impromptu tongs. She broke it open, releasing steam. The interior was soft, fluffy, pale. She tasted it cautiously, still bitter, but substantially less so than raw. The texture was pleasant, almost familiar. She offered pieces to the others. Dr. Phelan tried hers with visible skepticism that transformed into surprise. "This is actually good. Heat breaks down the compounds that make it bitter," Iris explained. "Changes the texture, makes it digestible in a way that goes beyond just non-toxic. Humans figured this out a long time ago. Most species figured it out at some point. We just remembered it." Corix consumed his portion methodically, analyzing the experience. "This is more effective than I anticipated. The application of direct heat creates chemical changes that improve palatability significantly." They ate the cooked tubers and greens, supplemented with small amounts from their nutrition packs. The hot meal in the cold morning provided comfort that transcended mere caloric intake. There was something psychologically stabilizing about food that tasted like food, about the ritual of preparation and consumption, about sitting together around a fire while eating something you'd made from the environment rather than synthesized from chemical components. Over the following days, a pattern emerged that wasn't quite routine but approached it asymptotically. Iris took the lead, not through authority. Nobody had appointed her, nobody had formal command, but through action. She maintained the fire, showing the others how to read it, how to understand when it needed feeding, and what kind of fuel it wanted. She established a rotation for fire watching through the night, because letting it die completely meant starting from scratch, and starting fires was harder than maintaining them. She taught them to identify good firewood. Green wood smoldered and smoked. Certain types of dead wood burned too fast, consuming themselves in minutes. Other types burned slow and steady, providing heat for hours. Resinous wood sparked and popped, sending embers flying. The right wood was dry, but not desiccated, dense but not waterlogged, collected from standing dead timber rather than ground falls where moisture could penetrate. They built a proper fire ring, banking earth around the stones to create a reflector wall that directed heat toward their sleeping area in the bunker. Corix applied engineering principles to the problem, calculating angles and heat transfer rates, turning primitive construction into something approaching science. The result was a structure that maximized efficiency, that kept them warm through the increasingly cold nights. Iris foraged systematically, mapping the local ecosystem in her mind. The streamside tubers were abundant and reliable. The forest edge greens grew in thick patches. A type of fungus that grew on dead logs proved edible after roasting. She tested cooking methods, direct flame roasting for quick searing, coal burial for slow cooking, boiling for tough vegetation, smoking over low coals for preservation. Some experiments failed. A bright yellow fruit that seemed promising turned caustic when heated, releasing vapors that made everyone's eyes water. A root vegetable that looked like the tubers turned out to contain compounds that cooking concentrated rather than broke down, producing spectacular but brief digestive distress in Mikhail, who'd volunteered to try it first. But most attempts yielded useful information, and the catalogue of edible palatable food expanded daily. The aliens began contributing their own expertise within this new framework. Dr. Phelan used her medical knowledge to ensure nutritional balance, identifying which local foods provided which necessary compounds. They needed protein, found in the fungal bodies and in small arthropod analogues that could be collected from the stream. They needed vitamins, available in various plant tissues. They needed minerals, present in certain fibrous roots. She created a rotation of foods that provided complete nutrition, that kept them healthy rather than just alive. Mikhail documented everything with the enthusiasm of someone who'd stumbled into his actual field of study. He was an anthropologist who specialized in pre-technological survival strategies, and he was now living through exactly what he'd only studied theoretically. He took notes on everything: fire management, food preparation, shelter improvement, tool creation. He interviewed each team member about their experiences, their adaptations, their emotional responses to living without technology. Corix improved the shelter incrementally, applying engineering principles to primitive construction. He created a smoke management system that drew fumes away from the sleeping area while retaining heat. He designed a water collection system that funneled rainfall into clean containers. He built a food storage area that kept things cool and dry, protected from local wildlife. His technical knowledge translated surprisingly well to practical application once he stopped thinking about efficiency ratings and started thinking about what actually worked. Iris taught them to read the weather through observation rather than instruments. Certain cloud formations preceded temperature drops. Wind direction indicated approaching storms. The local birds, not actually birds but the ecological equivalent, changed their behavior before weather events. This knowledge, passed through observation and practice rather than data analysis, felt simultaneously ancient and immediate. The aliens, who'd relied on sensors and predictive algorithms, found themselves watching the sky with new attention, learning to trust their own observations. The work was constant but not frantic. Iris established a rhythm: morning fire building, water collection and boiling, foraging, food preparation, afternoon maintenance, evening meal, fire banking, sleep rotation. The routine provided structure that kept panic at bay, that transformed survival from crisis into process. The aliens, initially uncomfortable with manual labor and primitive conditions, found themselves adapting. Their discomfort faded as competence grew. There was satisfaction in building the fire correctly, in identifying edible plants, in contributing to the group's survival. On the fifth day it rained again, not the catastrophic storm that had destroyed the outpost, but a steady downpour that turned the valley into a waterscape. They huddled in the bunker, keeping the fire going in the entrance where the overhang provided protection. Iris showed them how to keep flames alive in wet conditions, how to find dry wood even in rain, how to create a coal bed that generated enough heat to dry new fuel. They cooked soup in the boiling water, adding whatever vegetables they'd collected, creating something warm and sustaining while rain drummed overhead. Corix, watching the fire hiss and steam where raindrops found their way past the overhang, said something that surprised everyone, including himself. "This is actually quite pleasant." It was pleasant in a way that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with competence. They were wet and working hard and eating food that would have seemed primitive a week ago, but they were also warm and fed and functioning as a unit. The crisis had transformed into a situation they could manage, not through technology but through knowledge and cooperation. On the 9th day, the rescue ship arrived. Captain Vess was a pragmatic Raxi who'd conducted emergency evacuations from disaster sites across 3 sectors, and she'd seen the full spectrum of how people responded to crisis. She expected to find survivors in various states of distress, injured, malnourished, psychologically fragile, desperately grateful for rescue. What she found instead was 4 people sitting around a fire, cooking something that smelled disturbingly appetizing, discussing the proper technique for smoking a fish analog they'd caught from the stream using a net woven from plant fibers. She walked through the camp with visible confusion. There was the wreckage of the research outpost, exactly as catastrophic as the automated damage report had suggested. But there was also an organized living space, a well-maintained fire ring with a heat reflector, a food storage area, a water collection system, sleeping quarters in the bunker that showed signs of systematic improvement. The survivors looked healthy, reasonably clean, and were engaged in what appeared to be a culinary debate. "Are you?" Vess began, then stopped, recalibrating. "Are you all uninjured?" "Completely," Dr. Phelan confirmed cheerfully. "We've actually been doing quite well." The rescue team processed this information slowly. They'd brought emergency medical supplies, rations, thermal blankets, psychological support specialists. None of it seemed necessary. The survivors were already warm, fed and functioning. The debriefing occurred during the flight to the orbital station. The 4 survivors told their story with enthusiasm that seemed disproportionate to the situation's severity. They discussed fire management techniques and foraging strategies and cooking methods with the passion of people who'd discovered something genuinely novel. Corix had diagrams of the shelter improvements. Dr. Phelan had nutritional analyses of local foods. Mikkel had enough notes for 3 papers. Captain Vess listened with the expression of someone whose universe had tilted slightly. "So you survived 9 days without functional technology by cooking?" "Among other things," Iris said. "But yes, basically. Where did you learn this?" It was a reasonable question. Iris considered her answer. "My grandmother taught me. She learned from her parents, who learned from theirs. Humans went through multiple periods where pockets of civilization collapsed and had to rebuild. We retained the knowledge partly as cultural preservation, partly as insurance. My family kept these skills alive, not because we needed them, but because they were part of our heritage. Other species don't maintain such knowledge. Some probably do in different forms. But humans hit the technological age while still fragmented across a harsh planet with extreme environmental variation. We unified globally relatively late. Most species achieve planetary unification in more stable conditions, then progress technologically without maintaining the parallel track of environmental adaptation skills. We remembered because we had to remember until very recently. The captain processed this, looking at the 4 survivors, who seemed less like crisis victims and more like people returning from a successful camping trip. "You'll need to file detailed reports. Protocols require documentation of all survival incidents." "Already done," Mikkel said happily. "I've been documenting everything. It's fascinating from an anthropological perspective. We essentially recreated pre-technological survival techniques using academic knowledge and human practical experience. The psychological adaptation patterns alone are worth studying." Phelan added, I'd like to propose adding basic environmental survival training to the standard protocol for planetary research teams. What we learned could be valuable for future situations. Kurix nodded. The engineering principles of primitive technology are surprisingly sophisticated. I'm developing a manual for emergency shelter and heat management using only local resources. Captain Vase looked at Iris. You're very quiet for someone who apparently saved everyone. Iris shrugged. I showed them some techniques. They did the adapting. Humans know how to build fires and cook food, but that's just the starting point. They figured out how to apply their own expertise within a new framework. That's the actual skill, not the primitive techniques, but the ability to adapt when your normal tools fail. The ship accelerated toward the orbital station, leaving Kepler 283d behind. Iris found herself on the observation deck later, watching the planet recede. From orbit it looked peaceful, even beautiful, swirling violet storms, vast forests, mountain ranges that suggested tectonic youth. The destroyed research outpost was invisible from this distance, but somewhere down there was a fire ring, a shelter with improvements, marked trails where they'd foraged. Dr. Phelan joined her at the window. I'm planning to teach a seminar on survival techniques when we're back at the main station. Would you be willing to help? Sure, Iris said. Kurix wants to document the engineering principles behind fire management. He's calling it emergency applications of combustion technology. That sounds very Kurix. Mikkel is writing a paper titled The Persistence of Pre-Technological Knowledge in Post-Technological Species, a case study. I think he's considering it for his dissertation. Iris smiled. We spent 9 days making fires and cooking tubers, and somehow it's become an academic movement. It's more than that, Dr. Phelan said quietly. I've been in dangerous situations before. I've seen people fall apart when the technology fails, when they don't have the tools they expect. We didn't fall apart. We adapted. That's worth studying. She was right, Iris supposed. The universe was full of species that had conquered their environments through technology, that had solved every problem by building better tools, that had reached the stars by transcending their planetary limitations. Humans had done all that too, had built cities and spaceships, and civilization that spanned solar systems. But humans had also remembered, through some combination of cultural stubbornness and recent necessity, how to live with a planet rather than just above it. In the hierarchy of impressive achievements, building a fire and cooking a meal ranked considerably below faster-than-light travel. But when the sophisticated systems collapsed, when you stood in the ruins of your carefully constructed safety with only what you could carry and what you could figure out, knowing how to create warmth from gathered wood and make food edible with nothing but heat and patience turned out to be worth something after all. Not because it was advanced or impressive, but because it worked, had always worked, would always work, required nothing but knowledge and effort, and the kind of stubborn practicality that insisted things didn't have to be complicated to be effective. The planet disappeared behind them, and Iris thought about her grandmother teaching her to build fires on camping trips, insisting these skills mattered even when they seemed obsolete. She'd been right, obviously. The old woman had been teaching more than technique. She'd been teaching a way of thinking, a relationship with the physical world that didn't depend on intermediary technology. It was a gift that crossed generations, preserved not because it was necessary, but because someone thought it might be necessary someday, and being right about that kind of thing, years or decades or centuries in advance, was perhaps the most human quality of all.